May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Good morning. This is an odd place for it, but before I begin, I need to confess. Not everything stands in need of confession, but this does. I have a long personal history with this gospel text, and I cannot speak on it today unless I tell you how flagrantly I misused it nearly 20 years ago. When I was a child, one of my youth group leaders encouraged me to read the Bible. The Bible in the hands of a 12-year-old can be a dangerous thing. Sometime thereafter, my mother and I got into an argument about some incredibly trivial matter, my bedtime, I think. Of course, it wasn't an argument as much as a command I did not want to obey, and for which I was soon thereafter caught not obeying. That's when the argument took place. "Why did you not go to bed when I told you?" she asked. "Don't worry," I tried to assure her. "A prophet is never understood in his own home." WWJHSTT, what would Jesus have said to this? I cannot tell you, but I can tell you what my mother said. Seriously, though, what can be said to a child who thinks he can speak with the voice of a prophet at the tender age of 12 and know less about the injustice of bedtime rules? Well, not only was my sense of the nature and scope of justice slightly skewed, I also managed to completely flip the intent of Jesus' message. This passage from Luke is a continuation of Jesus' first sermon from last week's gospel. So important is this encounter, we spend 2 weeks examining it. Last week, we see Nazareth's favorite son return home as a lectionary reader in the synagogue. To the amazement of all in attendance, after Jesus finishes reading Isaiah's stirring, intentionally unsettling proclamation that the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. Jesus says with such presence and authority that proclamation, that call to complete and utter societal revolution, the flattening of mountains, the making straight of the broken path, that the lion will lay with the lamb, all of that has been fulfilled, Jesus says, today. Today, folks. All right, so that was last week. This week, we hear his hometown parish's reaction. We're told that they were amazed and that Jesus' words were gracious. Gracious. I don't think this is the reaction Jesus expects. Let's update the imagery a bit. Imagine Jesus walking into our parish and telling us that today we will end poverty. Today we will free those oppressed by the powers and principalities of this world. Today the blind will recover their sight. Go get them, you little whippersnapper. So Jesus, already a bit annoyed by their complacency, becomes more or less belligerent when they go on condescendingly to ask, "But isn't this Joseph's son?" Again, to update the imagery, they more or less say, "Ah, what a sweet message. But did he even graduate from high school?" The intent here by those in the synagogue is passive-aggressive. It's to cut Jesus down to size, to dismiss the radical response necessitated by his words. In response, Jesus ups the ante, so to speak. Jesus asks them to recall 2 stories from their own sacred scriptures, when God uses his own prophets to rescue and heal outsiders. A widow starving from famine and a Syrian general, nonetheless, with leprosy, neither of whom were children of Israel. Not only was the general not amongst God's so-called chosen people, he was a serious military threat to them. God sought them out, healed them, restored them, made them whole. The outsider. The outsider takes many forms, but most fundamentally, the outsider is the one cast out, intentionally or not, from our presence. The outsider is the one not here today. Jesus calls us to action for these people. The church is not a single tool made for one purpose, but this call is at the heart of our mission. To those who heard Jesus in the synagogue, this emphasis on the outsider was inferred to mean that God had passed over them, that their own values, way of life, their own traditions and troubles and illnesses were being dismissed by Jesus on behalf of God, and they tried to kill him for it. All of this forces the difficult question: who are we? As a group of people who come together to worship God, there will always be outsiders. What reaction did Jesus want? How should we understand our role as a church? Let me answer by way of a story of my own. When I first began work as the chaplain at St. Martin's, I received a text from a student asking me to meet him at the ER. When I arrived, I found out that he had been the victim of a horrible crime. We spent that agonizing night in the hospital and didn't leave until the sun began to rise in the morning. During the days that followed, we spent a lot of time together. There had been both physical and spiritual harm done, and in the midst of that pain, we often sat in silence. I listened to him speak about his fears for what might come as a result of his brutal encounter. I listened to what might have happened if the past had been altered only a bit, how a slight change in plans could have resulted in a saving act. We made small talk. I heard about his hometown, his family. I think I tried to pray. We laughed a few times, mostly though there was emptiness. A few days later, after a trip for supplies, I asked if he wanted some company in his dorm. No, he said, but if you'll come with me, I'd like to practice the piano. As I settled down to listen, he unceremoniously mentioned that he had never played for anyone else before. I'm not a musically sophisticated person, but for what was about to follow, I was well equipped. As my friend took to the piano, his hands first rested and then moved downwards. In a moment, music lifted to the ceiling, entirely filling the small room with its presence, an electrical current running through a wire. The chords were low, searching, humble, purposeful, each one sincere, each one finding resonance in a stroke. My soul began to lift. What filled that room was not just music. It was the hand of God. It seeped into me. It brought out everything beautiful and good, the human and the divine flowing into one another. Whether I was ready to let it in or not, it did not ask, and I could not hold it out. What was coarse was made smooth. What was stiff made to flex. It cut into me, knew where to find me where I did not know to look. I needed that, he said when he finished. Had you heard it before? No, I hadn't. It's called exile, he said. We are a church of exiles, exiles looking for exiles. This is at the core of this church. This is what's done at any number of the different ministries you will find here, that you are already active in. This is what we do at St. Martin's. We offer hospitality for hospitality's sake. In a world that seems bent on creating an image of the outsider full of suspicion and distrust, a world intent on further marginalizing those already at the margins, we recognize our own humble status, that our own temple of worship is not an end to itself, that we are pointed outwards in peace and reconciliation, that we work towards a world that respects the dignity of every human being. We do this where it is already acknowledged, and with the peace and power of God, we speak it out where it is not. The God we worship here is no tribal deity made in our own image to bless our own parochial interests. This means, sadly, that God was less concerned about my bedtime and more concerned with my willingness to grow into a person who will recognize and be attuned to the other, the outsider. Thankfully, none of us are held to the decisions of our 12-year-old selves, but also, thankfully, the directional shift outwards to the other means that there will always be fertile ground to work in, and that our work will never be done. In the name of God, amen.